Hi, you're watching Hindustan Times, and I'm Aditi Prasad. And today we're going to discuss a very, very important topic which we rarely talk about, which is our ecology, our environment, and specifically coral reefs. Beneath the surface of the ocean, we all know, lie these breathtaking colors, the vibrant colors of our diverse marine life. And these living organisms literally form these coral reefs, and they play a very, very crucial role in our ecosystem. Now, despite their significance, they face a severe threat, primarily due to human activities, and of course there is the larger elephant in the room, which is climate change. Today we've invited ecologists Mayuk Dey and Tanmay Wagh to talk about these beautiful creatures, what is their importance, and how can we, all of us, contribute towards conserving them, saving them, to save our ecology. Let me just first invite Tanmay, and Tanmay wants to obviously, we're looking forward to hear what you have to say. So I'll give the stage to you. Go on and present, especially in the context of India. And I know that you want to talk about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the research that you've done there. So please go ahead and show us what you've got.
Thank you, Aditi. Yeah, I'll just share my presentation. I hope it's visible to everyone.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Um, okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tanmay, and today, along with Mayuk, I'll be talking about ecosystems that are very close to our hearts, which are coral reefs, and specifically from the two places that we work in, which is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the Lakshadweep. But before getting into the technicalities of what we do or very region-specific things, we thought of taking one step back to answer the question that, at least for me, had come up when I'd seen coral reefs for the first time, which was, what are corals? Are they plants? Are they animals? Are they just rocks? Corals are animals which are very closely related to jellyfishes, and they're made up of numerous individual units called as coral polyps. The knob-like structures which you see in the image here are called coral polyps. These polyps have a ring of tentacles surrounding their mouths from which they trap food, which is the main source of nutrition for corals. And many of these coral polyps come together, secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton, and what we typically see is a coral colony, which is made up of multiple coral polyps. But what is really fascinating is that when we zoom into these polyps, we realize that inside these polyps lives another organism called zooxanthellae, which is a kind of algae. Now, the zooxanthellae is a photosynthetic organism. That means it traps sunlight to produce food. And a part of the coral's nutrition comes from the food that is trapped by these zooxanthellae. Now, the relation between zooxanthellae and the coral host has evolved over millions of years in a way that both animals benefit from each other and cannot survive without the other. So the coral gets some nutrition from the zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae in turn gets a lot of protection from being inside the coral tissue. Many coral colonies come together, grow, and form a coral reef. So, coral reef is not typically made of one species. We are looking at diverse systems, very similar to, say, a rainforest, which has different trees, shrubs, bushes. In the similar way, we have a lot of different organisms that make a coral reef. But because of their unique ecology, which is their dependence on sunlight, coral reefs are restricted to a very narrow belt in the tropics between 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south, where we have shallow, clear, and sunlit waters. So most of our coral reefs are distributed along this area. We have major reef formations in the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, the Caribbean and the Mesoamerican reefs in America, the large Indo-Pacific Coral Triangle, and of course closer to home in India. In India, we have major reef formations in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the Lakshadweep Islands, as well as in the Gulf of Mannar and Park Bay in Tamil Nadu. Along with this, there are also a lot of patchy corals distributed across the west coast of India as well as the run of Kutch. Now, like I was saying, coral reefs are very very crucial and very unique habitats which are home to many different species, right? So it's not just corals that call reefs their home. And what is fascinating about coral reefs, and this is something which truly sets them apart from many other ecosystems, is that for a system that occupies less than 1% of the ocean floor, which is hardly any, they are home to almost 25% of all marine species known to science. So we are talking about very small areas, but very high diversity of species. So you have your famous and charismatic species like sharks and snakes and turtles, but also a lot of other species which call reefs their home. For example, we have flatworms, we have pipefishes, we have seahorses, we have sea stars, we have Christmas tree worms, sea slugs, shrimp, sea urchin, reef fish, feather stars, and the list just goes on and on. Uh, and what is really fascinating is that a lot of these animals, a lot of these plants are found in waters around India, right? These are not photos from any other place. All these animals that live within coral reef ecosystems are also very intricately connected to each other. And what this means is that the loss of any particular species can have very dramatic impacts on the rest of the coral reef food chain. My research happens in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where we have a very unique type of reef structure called as fringing reefs. This is very different from the ones that Mayuk will be talking about when he talks about the Lakshadweep. But fringing reefs, which we typically see in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, extend right from the land, right? So it is, you'll see land, it ends, the reef starts, and there's a long reef flat followed by a slope where the reef ends. This is a view from one of our flights to Andamans. But what is unique and what many ecologists find fascinating is that these reefs in the Andamans are home to nearly 500 and more species of corals, more than 1,000 species of reef fish, and many more species of other organisms. But what is also of a lot of ecological and conservation importance is the fact that these reefs support lakhs of people that depend on them. And this is true not in the case of the Andamans, but all reef systems in the world. They are an important source of livelihoods from tourism and fisheries. They're an important source of nutrition for coastal communities who depend on seafood. And they form a very important physical barrier which protects islands from cyclones, tsunamis, and other strong catastrophic natural calamities. But unfortunately, the things that support these systems, the moment they increase in scale, they start becoming a little problematic. So, in many places, as the demand for fish or the demand for seafood increases, there is a tendency to move towards unsustainable fishing practices, which results in the removal of species which are very crucial for reef ecosystems. It results in the destruction of reef habitats in many places. It results in a lot of entry of a lot of pollutants and plastic into reef areas, and also gives rise to a lot of local threats. For example, there is a lot of entanglement of marine mammals, sea turtles, and other species in discarded fishing gear. There's a lot of terrestrial runoffs that enters reefs, which is quite a big problem in places like the Andamans, where we think that a lot of land-based pollution can potentially affect reefs in the long run because they can't breathe or they can't reproduce if they're covered by terrestrial sediment. At the bottom right, we are seeing one photo from a completely uninhabited island in the Andaman and Nicobars, with plastic bottles which have probably originated from various different countries but have been carried to these islands by water currents and other factors. So, pollution which originates in one place can have quite drastic consequences in places which are really far away. Um, but all these aside, like Aditi mentioned in her introduction, one of the biggest threats that coral reefs, not just in the Andamans, but in almost all other places, is climate change, rising water temperatures. Coral reefs are very resilient, but they are also extremely vulnerable to temperature fluctuations. Like we saw earlier, they are restricted to a very narrow belt seen in tropical waters, which are warm. But as these temperatures rise, corals unfortunately have very little ability to survive in these high temperatures. When temperatures rise and they sustain for a significant period of time, we see what is called commonly as coral bleaching. Mayuk will be talking a lot more about it in detail, but just to give a very basic context, when high water temperatures sustain for a long time, corals lose the association that they have with the zooxanthellae that live within their polyps. The moment the temperatures rise, these zooxanthellae leave the coral, and what is left behind is essentially just the calcium carbon skeleton, which very quickly gets covered by other animals, other opportunistic species. So a coral which housed a lot of biodiversity, which was supporting livelihoods through fisheries tourism, which was an important coastal barrier, loses all those useful functions the moment there is a bleaching event. Um, so closer to home in the Andamans, where we are doing research, what we are finding is that we know a lot about the different species that are found in our waters. There's been a lot of taxonomic work. There's been a lot of work on where different species are distributed. But unfortunately, there's very little we know about how these reefs are coping with change. And change is in today's time inevitable. It is there everywhere. So the organization that I work with, Dakshin Foundation, along with many other organizations in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, we are more and more trying to understand how these reefs are responding to change. When we dive, we try to understand how different levels of terrestrial pollution affect reefs, how fishing affects reefs, how reefs reproduce under different climatic situations, how do they grow, what are the different combinations of species that live in a particular area, or all of which are very important things to know if we are to conserve any of these reef systems. Unfortunately, a lot of these things require sustained long term efforts, and we are still in the process of figuring out what the situation is in the Andamans. But from the limited understanding that we have from certain systems and certain places, we know that despite having uh, been affected by different factors in the past, the reefs of the Andamans have had a fairly decent recovery trajectory. While at this point it is a little difficult for us to pinpoint exactly as to what those reasons could be, we think that it is because of the Andaman's unique geographical location, which has a unique set of water currents, water temperatures, wave action, rainfall, and temperature patterns, which are potentially one of the reasons why we have seen historically a little bit of recovery. But as the frequency and the intensity of these disturbances keep on rising, coral reefs, although resilient, eventually lose their ability to respond to these disturbances. Right? There's only so many disturbances a reef could potentially take, which is what makes understanding how these processes are functioning at a very local level, in our case the Andamans, is very crucial if we are to have any sort of conservation significance or actions which lead to the conservation of these reefs. When it comes to conservation, or when it comes to protection, largely what we need right now everywhere is increased global cooperation to limit, control, and mitigate the harmful impacts of climate change, which unfortunately continue to get more and more severe every year. But at a local scale, what we can do is we can improve the way we conserve coral reefs, which in some sense improves the ability of these reefs to buffer the impacts of climate change. Improved management involves sustainable fisheries, it involves sustainable tourism options, it involves having very localized conservation needs that are addressed through different kinds of policies, research. involvement of people in conservation programs, and so on and so forth. But a lot of times, a question that we typically get is, what can I, as someone who's staying far, far away from the Andamans or the Lakshadweep, do that can help coral reefs? And uh, the answer is a lot, right? For example, moving to sustainable or more responsible lifestyle choices can have very, very massive impacts on all these remote and fragile ecosystems. In case of coral reefs, it could mean choosing sustainable seafood options, trying to know where our fish is coming from, being responsible tourists, uh, you know, uh, having reduced and limited use of single-use plastics, increasing our awareness about how these systems work, and also contributing to growing citizen science efforts can really, really help how we see these systems, and whether we can conserve them in in the coming decades. Talk, and I will move to Mayuk, who will be talking a lot more about the reefs in the Lakshadweep Islands. Yeah, thank you. Aditi, I don't think you're audible.
Oh, here I am. Sorry, I was on mute. I'm saying because you were speaking, I said thanks. That was very, very enlightening. I think many of our viewers who've logged in, who sort of are watching this right now, and I'm sure many of them would agree that we are sort of not really, um, we don't even talk about ecology, forget about coral reefs. That's another very specialist area. And we should increasingly, given the fact that at the recently concluded G20 summit, one of the biggest talks was climate change. One of the biggest elephants in the room was climate change of global warming, and yeah, very interesting, very fascinating to get to know more about how coral reefs are really suffering due to not just climate change but also human intervention, and what we can do to sort of make a change, make a difference. Mayuk, I'd like to invite you now. Mayuk, please share with us what's happening in Lakshadweep. Thank you,
Sure.
for Tanmay, for sharing about what's happening in the Andamans.
Thank you.
Okay. Am I audible? Uh,
Yes, you are.
great. Tanmay, thanks a lot for giving us this overview of like what reefs are. That's especially critical for us to know going into this little section as well. Now, I'm doing my PhD currently with Nature Conservation Foundation, and my study site is the Lakshadweep. This year, when me and our team of divers went down, we were greeted to a site like this. This is an incredibly rare site for us because in 2016 we've had the last mass bleaching event. And after about 7-ish years, we're seeing this sort of a recovery in, not everywhere, of course, in small pockets and certain depths. So this was very heartening to see. But this is, when we visit this place this year or the next, beginning of 2024, we're probably going to be witnessing a complete graveyard. And that is, I'm getting ahead of myself actually. Let's go ahead with what these things are. As Tanmay mentioned, this is what a coral polyp looks like. This is one individual that you see.
Beautiful.
Well,
Yeah.
there are three out here, but yeah, this
Yeah.
is what an individual is, and they're clonal. So they clone themselves and they grow. So three of them are the same to some extent. You zoom out a bit and you see this particular, and this is the polyp. This is out of its hard calcium carbonate skeleton. And when you zoom out, you sometimes often have a single species, such as this. It's a Pavona clavus, that can occupy almost like this is a patch of probably about 100 by 100 meters of potentially the same individual that's cloned itself over thousands of years. So there are sites like this that are absolutely breathtaking. But when you dive in certain years, you often see the same site going a little white. They have this grayish tinge to it. And You visit other places and you see bleaching happening elsewhere. I mean, throughout the entire reef. And like Tanmay mentioned, it's this a symbiotic relationship between the algae and the coral just expels the algae. As a result, it doesn't have enough energy to survive, and it dies eventually. This is an individual. This is one of it's a Porites. The genus is a bit difficult. Species is a bit difficult to say. But these are one of the most resistant corals that we find to bleaching. And here we see a really large individual just completely bleached. This is happening, and it's a major concern this year. This is the only graph I have in the presentation. What is happening in this particular year is this exponential increase in sea surface temperatures, and it's breaking all sorts of records. You see the previous record of which was in March 2016 when the last bleaching happened, and this year we're already in a trajectory that has the potential to overshoot what happened in March 2016. This is absolutely problematic for a place like the Lakshadweep atolls. Now, Lakshadweep is a very coral atolls are fundamentally different in how they're formed compared to other fringing reefs. It's a multi-layered process. Fringing reefs are a part of it's a step towards coral atoll in some sense. So things that happen underwater eventually determine the little thin line of green trees that you see in the background. And this is exactly what Lakshadweep is. If often when you look at the map of Lakshadweep, they look like tea stains on a map. You can hardly tell. It's these little specks of dust that you see. And true enough, when you actually fly over and you go to these islands, you do see these islands are really small. They're nothing compared to the Andaman atolls. I think all total they have about 30 to 32 square kilometers of land that's available. Now, this is what you're greeted into. So if you're a tourist and if you're visiting Lakshadweep, this is the only airport that we have right now in Agati. This is the landing strip, and this is what you're greeted to. However, there's a lot of things that are going underneath the waves. And I'd like to take a bit of time to actually tell you, a potential tourist who's visiting the atolls, what is actually going on. So when you visit this place, you get a sense of where you stand and how precarious this is. This is the lagoon. The lagoon is a patchwork of extensive coral growth like this. There's vast stretches of sand. There are lots of sea grasses, and even though sand is out there and it's often termed as this bare ground, it is absolutely crucial in how the islands build and maintain themselves. So this is what the lagoon looks like to some extent. Not all the time, of course. Not in every places, but yeah. When you go to the beach and you see this calm lagoon that exists and this very picturesque place, this is absolutely a filtered out version of what's happening outside. Now we've been monitoring the team. NCF has been working in Lakshadweep since '98. This is its 25th year. Contrary to the Andaman and Nicobars, we actually have a fair understanding of how coral reefs and, among other things, have changed over a quarter of a century. And it's a mix of both good and bad news. There are, like Tanmay mentioned, a lot of things like ocean currents, wave exposure determine whether certain places of a reef are able to come back after repeated mass bleaching events, or some places don't. So you've got this really patchy framework of resistance in recovery in a reef. But the coral reef as an ecosystem provides two very critical functions for coral atolls. And this has to do with a balance between accretion and erosion. Now, Tanmay mentioned how corals are able to assimilate calcium carbonate from the seawater and, and incorporate them into their skeletal system. Now, that's the accretion layer. It's accreting calcium carbonate. In fact, all shelled animals right now in this day and age have calcium carbonate, a particular crystal of calcium carbonate in their skeletons. And you've got a whole host of other organisms that directly or indirectly actually eat them. You've got urchins, you've got parrotfishes, you've got physical processes such as currents and waves that actually rub shells together and break them down into smaller particles. And parrotfishes and urchins, as they as they chew on the organic matter, the inorganic matter just comes out, and it's suspended in the water column, often in terms of fine grains of sand. And this is what a coral reef actually looks like. It's a fine balance between what is growing and what is dying. All the sediment that you see out here is either physically broken down or actually biologically generated and gets reincorporated into the reef, the hard rocky structure that we see. So a coral, so this is a reef that's actually jutting out of in one of the atoms. And so yeah, so Tanmay is right. A coral is a plant and an animal and a rock at the same time. So this, when you go out uh, and you see this very nice surf type wave and
Yeah.
the surf generating out here, this is a critical function that the coral reefs are actually able to provide. Because you have a reef out there, all the swell waves, all the oceanic waves that are out there in the distance are meeting the reef, and because of friction breaking over. And because of that breakdown, all that energy that's here is getting dissipated over the reef. As the water moves in and you go into the lagoon space, you see these beds of sand. Whenever you have the right kind of wave passing through, you see this entire cloud of sand actually pop up and flow with the current. And this is what leads to the deposition of sand that we see as beach. Now, the difference between Lakshadweep or atolls in general and places like Andaman and Nicobar is that all the sand that you see are completely biologically generated. There is, in Andaman, for example, you've got vast rivers and streams, you've got soil. Those often get washed during the monsoon, and then again, they get transported back to the beach. So you've got a combination of both silicate or terrigenous sediments, sediments derived from land and sediments derived from the ocean. But atolls are exclusively sediment derived from the reef. So when we look back at this place that we're flying into, you suddenly see a very precarious and bounded existence. Things outside this little ring of white is uninhabitable. Obviously, it's the open ocean, but things inside have such a finite space. The elevations are not high. I mean, as you can see, it's maybe 2 meters, 3 meters at most above sea level. And this is a problem given sea level rise, which is a thing. One of the work that we're doing right now is studying these shallow water reefs, looking at how fast they're able to grow and how fast the erosion elements are actually taking away bits and pieces. How much is the sediment being able to get? How much of the sediment is actually getting reincorporated into the reef, and what gets like thrown off into the beaches? And just a caricature of what's happening. This is what a coral reef typically looks like. But because you've got so many bleaching events happening and so many other stresses, localized stresses as well, you see this sort of a very dead reef. You remove some of the bleached corals and you've got this empty space that's there, which is colonized by other eroding organisms. So suddenly you've got an entire reef that's actually getting eroded way more than it's actually building up. Add to this sea level rise, and this the space between the reef and the water column that exists increases. And what does that mean for something like wave buffering? This has been taken in during June, July, last monsoon. Uh, Strong winds generate this huge wave, and they're able to completely move over the reef and get deposited onto the. This this intense monsoon, intense cyclonic conditions is an actual, the climate change is the primary cause of this. And this has led to actual inundations on these little spits of sand that we see out here, which makes life absolutely difficult for people out here. Remember, coral atolls don't also have rivers. So all the fresh water that you find is only because of rain that falls, gets percolates into the soil, stays there as a very thin lens. So if you add salt water on top of that, it mixes it up and completely makes it. You can have engineering solutions as desalination plants, but there are chances that you can't construct desalination plants everywhere because it is a small pace of a spit of sand. On top of that, you've got waves such as the ones that you've seen that come and batter these shores. So you can only create these structures in certain sheltered locations, which isn't much out here in the open ocean. Now, when I was in Kavati and the electricity had gone out for about half an hour or so, uh, we just immediately went to the jetty to get a good view of the full moon out there. And it made me think of the future of these really low-lying and fringing these frontier ecosystems to some extent. Is this a glimpse of what we will see of the Lakshadweep maybe 50 to 100 years down the line? It sounds pessimistic as it sounds extremely pessimistic, but right now, if the world were to go carbon neutral in the click of a finger, we would still have about 30 centimeter of, well, average 30 centimeter of sea level rise for sure because of the Greenland ice melt that has happened. So no matter what we do at this point, there is still a short rise of 30 centimeter. Now, those little calculations add up for people that are living in elevated lands that are not more than 2 meters. This is where I leave you. A, a, a frontier land that is under actual existential threat. So what I tried to convey through my presentation is a sense of where we go to. When we go to and visit these lands, what can we expect? What's the what is actually happening within these systems? That is what I want to leave you with. And yeah, I think I'll stop here for now.
And I think that is what is critical, because some beautiful pictures, but yeah, what is happening behind is the real story, really. And it's important, right? I mean, I have always wondered why, the sea is a very important resource for human beings as well as for the planet. uh, but simple effective things, behaviors that we can adopt, especially if we are even visiting the sea. For people like me in Delhi who are not next to the sea is a faraway thing, and but we do plan at least some holidays every year near the sea, especially all of us. What can we do to contribute better to saving this ecology? If you could sort of pinpoint for our viewers, I'll start with you, Mike.
Uh, I think Tanmay would have been a better person to start with because
I'll
I
go with
will
Tanvi
probably
after that.
I would say there's honestly there are things happening at so many scales. Ultimately, our day-to-day activities probably won't really make much of a difference given what the driver is at the global level. But that does not mean that we are not responsible in our actions and what we do. Sure, we can make informed decisions, we can be a bit more compassionate, we can be a bit more understanding, we can be a bit more thoughtful on what we do.
Hmm.
But it is in no way uh, a substitute for things that need to happen at a much larger global scale. So, yeah.
Got it. Tanmay, Tanmay Bagh, would you like to weigh in there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Mayuk says, but I also feel that people like us who are living in cities, who are in some way in some positions of power, I think we also need to be a lot more vocal about
Yeah.
a lot of these things that are happening. We need to equip ourselves with what is happening on ground, right? Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, people from the Lakshadweep or Andamans or many of these places, remote places, don't have the kind of voice that we do or the ability to articulate problems the way uh, other people potentially can. So I think while I agree with Mayuk that the small daily choices that we make, while important, may not uh, address the elephant in the room. I think um, we need to be a lot more we need to like be a lot more aware and a lot more vocal about
Sure.
some of these things and try to influence in whatever little way we can through different media that the privileged like us have access to make any sort of change that is possible.
And
That's
where, how would you say, would you call this the biggest threat to this coming from to our marine ecosystem coming from climate change, or is it humans, or is it both? I mean, the humans are affecting whatever's happening with climate change. I understand that, but what is of what is the one thing that is the biggest threat to our marine ecology today? Tanmay?
I I think the biggest overarching threat is definitely climate change, but I would still think that at local scale, the nature of these threats differ. It could be like it could be something in the Lakshadweep, it could be something else in the Andamans. But all of these are human induced, right? Like people from the Lakshadweep have not really contributed to I mean, everyone has, but not to an extent that people from developed parts of the world or, more developed sections, even in other places have. So definitely human induced, but I think the like a more intense driver for degradation might be a lot more localized depending on different reef systems.
I hear you. All right, I think that gives us a fair sense of where we are, what we need to do, and thank you both for weighing in and for sort of making our viewers aware of this. And I hope many of our viewers are living near the seas, near the waters, unlike many of us who are landlocked in the city of Delhi. But and both of you, commendable work that is being done, and you're working behind the scenes. And let's hope that many of our people, of all of us, humankind, becomes more sensitive to the needs of our marine ecology. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with our viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you.